My guest today is, again, Louisa Durkin. She is a biodiversity and agri-food systems analysis at Metabolic and a member of the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Centre. Louisa holds a Bachelor of Science in Molecular Genetics and a Public Health minor from the University of Rochester, New York, and a Master of Science in Biodiversity Systematics from the University of Gothenburg Nordic Academy for Biodiversity Systematics. Louisa has been a collaborator and friend of mine for a little over 2 years, and she has been wonderful and really keeps me focused on solutions. Louisa will be speaking to us today about biodiversity and food security. Louisa, such a pleasure to have you again. Thank you so much, and welcome.
Great. Always a pleasure to meet you in the garden. All right, so today the title of today's talk is about the endangered banana. And I came to molecular biodiversity through food. That's really the avenue that interested me the most. And I think talking about genetic diversity and our food system is something fun, and it's especially interesting through the lens of one crop, and banana is a great example. So I'm going to share my screen, and Claire, I think you have to allow me to share. If you're a fan of Claire's art, then you're probably pretty familiar by now with the concept of biodiversity, as it is a common theme for her, for sure. And biodiversity is a concept that includes all life on Earth, kind of thinking about it in 3 different levels, understanding the variety of species that exist on this planet, the variety of ecosystems or habitats that exist on this planet, and the variety of kind of genetics that exist as well. So on that DNA and molecular level, that is a level that I'm particularly interested in, and kind of how our current food system has shifted towards kind of a limited genetic diversity pool. Most of our global food system is just a few crops, and within those crops, they're pretty much all the same variety. We'll talk a little bit about that today, and kind of the behind the scenes of genetic diversity and our food system through the lens of the banana. So if you consider the produce aisle, for example, the fruits and vegetables available at your average grocery store won't differ too much depending if you're in Sydney, Australia, or New York City, or Amsterdam. But this is normal to us because this is kind of what we grew up with and what we expect. We expect bananas, and we expect bread, and we expect apples, but it's not that long ago that we wouldn't have had nearly the same variety of food options that we have now. So nowadays, bananas are flown in from warmer climates to cooler ones, and much of what we see is shipped or flown to reach our grocery store shelves. But it's not just where the food comes from, because I think we kind of all understand that not all of our food is grown locally, but rather I am particularly interested in where the food comes from on a more existential level. So where does food originate? Different areas of the planet have different centers of biodiversity for each crop. And how did crops end up being grown in different places? Why is understanding this important to protecting centers of biodiversity? So why do we care that crops are coming from different places? We'll talk a little bit about that. And what is a crop center of biodiversity at all? So this is one of my favorite graphics from one of my favorite science articles. It's probably pretty small for a lot of people, but the scientists evaluated the genetics. So they looked at the DNA code, and they can trace back evolutionarily, like detectives, based on the order of the DNA sequence to identify where food crops have their centers of biodiversity. So the center of biodiversity is where a crop originated and was domesticated. So a lot of the crops that we currently eat, take cabbage, for example, did not start out looking how it looks in the field or in the grocery store. It started out as a plant that people decided they liked one particular trait and bred that plant for that one particular trait. Same thing with strawberries. They crossed 2 strawberry species to get the one that we have now, which is a hybrid. But understanding where crops have their center of biodiversity is important to protect our food sovereignty and our food system, because it is from, for example, for the banana, where the center of biodiversity is in kind of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and kind of Northern Australia. You can see it a little bit on this map. That is where the banana grows wild, or the banana's relatives grow wild in forests. Which means if anything goes wrong with the banana crop, we look to the relatives of the crop to find different solutions in the DNA to protect the world's food system. So 400 years ago, for example, there were no tomatoes in Italy. They came instead from domestication in the Andean mountains. Pineapples didn't reach Hawaii until the 1800s, late 1800s. So it's definitely a misnomer that pineapples are from Hawaii, rather they're from the Amazon rainforest. Peanuts, watermelon, and okra all came from Africa to North America with enslaved peoples. So there's a lot of kind of socio-cultural history associated with our food and with these crop centers of biodiversity. So not only is it important to protect our food system, but also the traditions and histories of people, which are intertwined. And even though we're talking about things scientifically, I think it's always important to mention kind of, we don't just exist in a scientific world, we exist in a socio-cultural world as well. All right, so the wild crop relatives are the plants that are related to the often domesticated crops that we eat. And those are what are essential for a healthy food system and a flourishing culture. But I think we'll get into a little bit of how the banana fits into all of this. So what are the important centers of biodiversity for the banana? Well, first, let's pause and do a quick science lesson. I know this picture is probably a little fuzzy, but it is a zoom in of the banana flower. So what happens is that the banana flower is pollinated, seeds are made. We'll talk about the fact that the banana has no seeds in a minute, and that this process is sort of irrelevant to the bananas that we're familiar with, but just bear with me. The seeds are pollinated, and very similarly to humans, there is 2 sex cells, pollen and an ovum, which you can liken to a sperm and an egg, that fertilize one another, create, kind of mix up the genetics, and then create a new plant. So this is the typical process for the banana. They're often fertilized by bats, fun fact. And this sexual reproduction that plants and people and animals all partake in, not all, but most, is kind of like the engine of evolution. Evolution drives on this like mixing of genetic information to create something new. Same thing with mutations. Mutations are often problematic, but truly they are the engine of evolution, and that is kind of how evolution progresses. So if you have kind of these wild crop relatives that are being naturally pollinated, and then the engine of evolution hasn't stopped there. That's going to be kind of an important concept through this discussion. I want to just click through some images of the beautiful banana from naturalists. These are mostly taken in the 1800s, before most of the forests were deforested, where the banana's center of biodiversity and wild crop relatives are. There were pink ones, little ones, fat ones, really thick skins. You can see here there still are seeds in this variety of banana. Here again are the flowers that then are pollinated, or in some cases not pollinated, but the fruit grows out of this area where the flower is. Once those are expired, you can see here the flower is at the bottom, the banana fruits are at the top. Little ones, these are red bananas. This is the Gros Michel banana that we'll talk about a little bit. This is kind of how you would see a banana in the wild. But so we know that the banana was domesticated. So what did it look like before? This image kind of in the bottom right shows you the wild type relative of the banana. A lot of seeds, so you'd have to kind of eat around all those seeds. It kind of looks like a guava to me. And the picture above is what we have now. So how did we get there? Domestication is expected to have happened in Papua New Guinea. So an island kind of off the coast of Australia and in Southeast Asia, and then spread throughout the area. And that process happens by selecting what people want. But bananas are interesting because you do not, to create new banana trees, they have little suckers that grow up next to them, kind of like a blade of grass. If you can imagine, that grass has all shared the same root system, and new grass pops up. It doesn't necessarily need seeds each time to create a new blade of grass through the soil. Bananas act the same way. So this new blade of grass or new banana coming up acts like it is a clone of the banana next to it. So they are genetically identical. So what we were talking about before, that engine of evolution where you have the sexual reproduction of the fruit, that's not happening anymore for bananas. We'll go into that. Okay, so domesticated in Papua New Guinea and then spread kind of in the early times through the Indian subcontinent and then to Africa. And now we kind of understand that bananas are basically, they're one of our favorite grocery store items, and they're basically produced everywhere and anywhere that the climate is warm enough. But that has not always been kind of a healthy, easy process. And bananas have also been, just like many fruits, part of a capitalist, let me think about how to say this. The commodification of the banana has caused some people to become very wealthy and others to be extremely exploited. And this is kind of covered in the concept of a banana republic, which a lot of Latin American countries were exploited for their fertile land. Other areas were cleared, and there was a lot of capitalist issues with the banana in these areas. And I just think it's important, I'm not going to dive too much into it, but I think it's important to touch upon and realize kind of how complicated food systems are, and that there's a lot of complex history there. And even though it's a fun and interesting scientific concept, there's a lot of sociocultural underneath there. So the Cavendish banana was the most popular, is currently the most popular clone of banana. This is what we're all familiar with in the grocery store, but it's only been around since the 1950s. like we talked about before, banana crops are clones of one another. Here I try to depict the root system and the bananas popping up. So this little one is a clone of that bigger one next to it. They're not grown from seed. So we do not have that engine of evolution. Rather, with bananas, it's kind of like you've hit pause on evolution, taken this evolutionary product, domesticated it, and now are cloning it. So they're all genetically identical. If you sequenced the genes of a banana, you will see that they're all almost exactly the same. And this is sort of shows you the process. This is a banana laboratory with all of the clones kept very safe. But before the 1950s, the Gros Michel banana was the most popular clone. But the Gros Michel was attacked by a fungi that had adapted to eat the roots of these banana plants. So the problem when you press pause on evolution is that other pests and can adapt very quickly to attacking this banana. So when you are able to kind of infiltrate one, you can infiltrate them all because there are no differences in the genetics, therefore pest maintenance mechanisms of these different plants. This is an image of the Gros Michel banana. It looks like a modern day plantain. So because they're all genetically identical, the banana plants had no way to adapt to protect themselves. So this allowed the fungi, known as the Panama disease, to spread quickly and wiped out all of the banana plantations. So they created the Cavendish banana at that point, which is found on today's grocery store shelves, because people turned to the banana's genetic reservoir in the Southeast Asian rainforests that we were talking about before. So it's a direct example of kind of how the wild crop relatives of the banana were used to protect the crops that we find in our grocery store. So they originated from here, and there are about 70 different species in the wild. But right now, the Southeast Asian rainforests are being depleted at an alarming rate, and without the forest, there will be no genetic reservoirs for people to dip into, and effectively it will disappear. And this is true because the Panama virus is back, which means it's been found in Australia, and so they're taking extreme precaution to be able to protect the fungi from not reaching other areas, specifically Latin America. But it is almost inevitable that at some point it will reach because we have this incredibly globalized world at this point. So the goal is now scientists are researching. So that's why we call the banana endangered. Scientists are researching other genetic materials, also from wild crop relatives, in order to kind of create a new banana clone that can be used in our global food system. So I have just some resources here. If you want to continue down this path of learning, these are some of my favorite resources. Civil Eats is a really great food sovereignty news outlet. I highly recommend kind of getting engaged there if you're interested in kind of the nuances of our global food system, sociocultural and also scientific. A Cooking Gene is a really exceptional book about how genetics, food, and human exploration has all been intertwined. If you want to learn more about the origin of crops, where each of those crops come from, this image I showed at the beginning, you can look at this CGIAR blog. It's a really, really great article there. If you want to watch stuff, the Botany of Desire has a really great, is a really great documentary by Michael Pollan, also a book, and it talks about evolution from the plant's perspective, how they use us to get what they want. It talks about tulips in particular. I think that's very funny and interesting. Gather is a movie about indigenous food sovereignty. and getting involved. I have some suggestions. If you're concerned about the deforestation, my main suggestion is just to reduce your meat consumption. This is something we can all do, but we really truly need policy and lobbying to happen in order to make changes in the system with deforestation. But spreading awareness and understanding how things are connected is really important too. The more that we know, the more we know the right things to advocate for. Buying biodiverse food and wine is also great. One of my friends runs an Instagram called Industry Sessions. It's all people of color who are interested in diverse wine, and that is a great place to spend some of your money. And I think that's it from me. So if there's any questions.
Oh, Louisa, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. One second, let me. One second, let me. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh yeah.
Sorry. Great. Hi. That was so interesting. I gasped and went, oh, that's a bat pollinating the banana flower. I learned so much just now. And yeah, one thing that was interesting when you were speaking, I'm actually reading a book right now, which I think that you've also read, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And so good. And it was talking about scale economies. And one of the examples that they gave was sugar plantations. Also, I didn't realize that the sugar is also a clone of itself. And
yeah, also a grass.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay. I didn't know that. Yeah, I grew up surrounded by sugarcane plantations because until I was 6 years old, I was in northern Brazil. And it was so interesting. They were talking about this, like the idea of capitalism and scaling, like scaling up economies, and how that happens when it comes to basically nature, right? So to crops and plants, and the destruction that it leads to, right? How many ecosystems have been destroyed because of sugar plantation. And then of course there's the legacy of slavery and colonialism sort of layered on top of that. And I think I never really realized that of course the banana is also a clone of itself and also has a very similar history. And that we're really on a brink. And I love bananas, so that's very sad.
Yeah, and to me, it's anything that is called plantation, honestly, right? Like that's kind of a red flag because that's an exploitive system and one that, was built on the bodies of slaves. And I think it's easy to examine anything called that. So there's little red flags in our language too that can alert us to where if we're moving toward regenerative practices when we're kind of like still in an exploitive system.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you know of any sort of alternatives aside from I guess you mentioned Demeter and or Demeter, I guess. How do you say it?
Yeah, Demeter, biodynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all we go to the grocery store, and I think just having that level of awareness of the history of the food that we're eating is important because it can help inform us in other parts of our life. I don't think any one person, I really don't think there's a level of individual change, and I think eating less meat is really indirectly is protecting the banana, which is very strange because then it's less cropland for feed and less destruction of the rainforest. So to me, that's kind of like the priority thing that an individual can do whenever it comes to deforestation. But truly it's about getting people thinking about these kind of systemic issues and how we can have a global accountability system that has policies that protect the forests in a meaningful way. So we're working towards that, but not there yet.
Yeah, and that's actually a great plug for your next talk about the rights of nature, right? How do we come up with a framework for protecting biodiversity? You have a couple questions, or 3 questions actually. The first one is if we can get a copy of your slides.
Yeah, for sure.
I can send that out to anyone who RSVP'd. I'll go ahead and do that. And Mimsy asks, why only limes in South America and no lemons?
Good question. I guess you were looking at that map in the beginning, and I think citrus has a really confusing, so plants, I don't know, we can get into the genetics here a little bit. So plants have really complicated genomes where there's a lot of humans, we have 2 copies of each of our chromosomes. Sometimes you have 3, which there are certain genetic disorders that come about in this way, but it's very rare. Plants can have many different copies in their genome of chromosomes, and they're called polyploids. And citrus has a really complex genome and also a complex history. So there are like finger lines are native to Australia and parts of Australasia. And then I'm pretty sure the orange is coming kind of from Northern Africa, the Mediterranean region. And so it's, their pomegranate is actually a citrus fruit. So there have been like kind of these domestication patterns of citrus. And I can't necessarily explain why only limes in South America, no lemons, but just I guess my answer to that is that citrus is complicated. We could do a history of citrus next. I tried to do that one once and I got a little lost.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So Louisa, thank you, says Kiatra, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Can you explain a little more about genetic reservoirs and their impending depletion? What scale or timeline has research estimated for this depletion to impact food security?
Yeah, that's a good question. So since 1970, we have increased our agricultural intensification by 80%. So that's just a good, if you're thinking about scale. So right now, pretty much all of Earth's arable land is being used for farming. That's about they say between 60 to 70% of ice-free land, which is kind of a crazy statistic. And it's not, it's not all cropland. A lot of it is pasture land, or maybe forestry, some of it, but we really kind of are at that level where if we start to continue to encroach on nature, there is going to be no reservoir, so to speak, for our wild crop relatives. And we are already starting to see impacts of kind of deforestation. Deforestation is the main one because for bananas, for example, are they're genetic reservoirs. So when I say that, I mean areas where there is genetic diversity for banana. That is all in kind of the Southeast Asian rainforests, South and Southeast Asian. So yeah, another example of kind of a symptom of the depletion of genetic reservoirs is a pandemic, for example. So when nature is kind of confined to smaller areas, then there's more inbreeding. And similar to humans, like this does not create the most resilient systems or people, inbreeding causes a lot of genetic disorders. And so that's kind of, my example of another consequence of the depleted genetic reservoirs. But it's pretty dire, I would say. This past year in 2020, deforestation increased 17% in the Amazon. So it's really something that, we can all spend a little bit of time thinking about our role and what we can do to push our policymakers in the right direction for protecting nature.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this conversation so much, and I'm learning so much. And I rode my bike today to meet a friend in Tiergarten, and in Tiergarten there's a lot of statues and sort of big monuments. And there was one of Atlas carrying the world, and he's like, hunched over, and the world is above him. And I was just thinking like that's such an old fallacy, and I feel like and I'm like, now that I'm like connecting, you know, and learning more about indigenous wisdom, it's like the earth carries us. We are fed and nurtured by the earth. And I thought I wanted to put a disclaimer on the on the statue and be like, no, you're not carrying the earth. The earth is carrying you. She's nurturing and feeding and sustaining you. And you know, it's interesting. I think, I mean, I was really surprised. I didn't realize myself that bananas were endangered. I think that we have, at least I had moved to a place that I was like, food comes from supermarkets, you know, and that's, yeah, it's a dangerous place to be, because you're forgetting the source of where it's all coming from. And I don't know, this is, sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but I really did feel like that thought, that sort of like man conquers nature, man carries the world, that is really at the root of so much of this issue, right? Like we can't dominate nature, because we are nature. And,
Exactly.
and what does it mean to conquer nature? Is that, you know,
No, and you really hit on something, because that mindset is kind of this exploitive mindset. I'm stealing something from my master's thesis advisor, Kim Nicholas, who has a great book out about kind of prioritizing yourself and your energy right now in the face of global crisis, because we can't do everything. And when we go to the grocery store and we want to make healthy decisions, we want to make, you know, decisions that are good for the planet, we want to make decisions that are good for the budget, all these issues, and we can't, you know, single-handedly carry the world, right? And so instead we have to think about, how are we connected to this system? And I think that mindset shift will allow us to really move in a different way in the world, and rather, okay, I'm gonna eat meat one time this week because that's my personal contribution, and that is a personal contribution that matters. There are very few personal contributions that matter in the grand scheme of things, and this is one. And I think kind of, yeah, shifting your mindset a little bit in that way, because you want to feel connected rather than dominate, is important.
Yeah, there was actually a really wonderful recent podcast on how to save a planet with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, who I just adore everything she does. And she was, it was a conversation about individual action versus systemic action. And I mean, one thing that she said that I think really resonated with me is that doing individual actions that are aligned with the systemic changes you want to see in the world can be really nourishing, and it kind of sustains you and gives you the power to keep fighting for that world that we want to live in that will require systemic changes. And then another thing that was interesting is that they sort of broke down the you know, individual actions versus systemic changes, and basically, like, statistically we're so small, it's hard to have these individual actions make a difference. But one thing that really does matter is like the multiplier effect, right? Like if everyone in this room, in this, you know, conversation went out and started talking, like, next time you eat a banana, did you know that this is extinct, right? Like, share this knowledge. It's not very widely known, and it's so important. And I think that those, Sherry Mitchell did this beautiful metaphor of that we're all dandelion seeds, right? Sort of thrown to the wind. And I think that that's a powerful metaphor for me when I'm thinking about individual versus systemic changes, is that I can fight and push for the systemic changes and also be a dandelion seed. Yeah.
And nourish yourself, you have to do that. And I agree. Having the conversations and feeling connected is really essential.
Yeah. My mom has a question about coconuts. And my mom asked, does Hawaii has coconuts? Question mark.
Yeah, coconuts are an interesting one. I think I saw it in a few of the different places. Coconuts are one of the seeds that can travel across the ocean and then sprout in new places. So I'm not surprised that they're on multiple different crop centers of biodiversity, but to be honest, I'm not looking at it right now. But I think if it's not in Hawaii, that means it didn't originate there, and if it is, that means that it did. But I can definitely send the link to that article. It's really good. You can stare at that chart for hours, for sure.
Louisa, this has been a joy. It was exactly what I needed today. Thank you. I feel nourished.
Totally a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and you know, actually, I selected a small text like I did last. I don't have a poem. I looked for a banana poem. I didn't immediately find one. But this is a passage from a really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she has a passage about gardening that felt really beautiful and resonant to our talk today. So knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate it. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. This is really why I made my daughters learn to garden, so they would always have a mother to love them long after I am gone. I know. Yeah, so thank you for teaching us about how much the earth loves us and how much she gives us.
Oh, well, thank you.